everybody. Welcome to our 2025 Frederick Douglass Address. I'm Michael Gonzalez, the Executive Director of the Institute of American Constitutional Thought and Leadership. The Institute is a new program at the University of Toledo. We offer courses, degree programs, scholarships, and study abroad opportunities for the UT community. But a core part of our mission is also to provide public programs like today's address. The Ohio General Assembly established the Institute in 2023 to cultivate civic community life. The enduring American Republic needs forums like this in order to flourish. James Madison writes in a 1822 letter to William Barry that education cannot be too much applauded. A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. The Ohio Constitution echoes Madison's argument in Article 1, Section 7, when it attests that knowledge is essential to good government. Today, we're assembled to discuss the life and political thought of Frederick Douglass, an ardent advocate of liberal education as the only sure way to escape slavery. Born into slavery in February 1818, Douglass died in February 1891, a free man, an independent thinker, and a heroic statesman. He's an enduring model for the American Republic and is an apt figure to reflect on in our times. Joining us today is Professor Lucas Morel. Professor Morel is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics and head of the Politics Department at Washington and Lee University. He holds a PhD in political science from the Claremont Graduate School. Professor Morel has held fellowships at Princeton University and Hillsdale College. He's the author of 2 books on Abraham Lincoln. He is a board member of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, a trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society, a consultant for the Library of Congress and National Archives, and also serves on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, thank you, which will plan activities to commemorate the 250th anniversary of American independence. In his spare time, he offers public lectures and leads discussions on Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. He's a very busy man, and we are very proud to have you here as our inaugural speaker for what we hope will become an annual Frederick Douglass Address. So please join me in welcoming Professor Morel.
Douglass would have been a natural fit for your institute because of his commitment to the Constitution and the habits of mind and character that I believe are necessary for the flourishing of a constitutional, that is to say, a self-governing way of life. Frederick Douglass spent his adult life speaking and writing about important political matters, beginning, of course, with the abolition of slavery, and then working for the equal protection of the laws for all Americans, regardless of race and sex. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a leading activist for women's rights, recalled watching Douglass give a speech. He stood there like an African prince, majestic in his wrath, as with wit, satire, and indignation, he graphically described the bitterness of slavery, the humiliation of subjection to those who, in all human virtues and powers, were inferior to himself. His ferocity of spirit was matched by a fierce intelligence that produced not only his renowned narrative, the first of 3 autobiographies, but also speeches and editorials that stand as essential contributions to the progress of liberty in America. That intelligence led a man who had every reason to hate America to become one of her greatest defenders. Douglass became famous during America's most trying times, the antebellum and Civil War eras, when bullets took precedence over ballots. Douglass kept the faith that ultimately words had to prevail over violence for a free people to govern themselves by appealing to right rather than might. I've titled my talk, Frederick Douglass, The Making of an American. And we will see what that journey of becoming an American looked like. A key part of that journey was his fervent exercise of the freedom of speech, without which Douglass believed no civilization could progress, and in fact what he believed was essential to the abolition of slavery. His concern for freedom of speech was no abstract consideration. He and other abolitionists routinely faced hostile crowds. Even in New England, they tried to shut down their rallies. In slaveholding states, they went so far as to censor the mail of any abolitionist publications, and they even prohibited slaves from reading. Of all, and learning to read for that matter, of all the harms that Douglass attributed to slavery, he thought that the denial of an education was the worst of its ills. It would forever unfit him to be a slave, Douglass recalled his legal master saying, when he discovered Douglass being taught his letters and how to spell. From that moment, Douglass said, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. He believed education, the cultivation of one's reason, and the character fit for a free life, was essential to the improvement of any human being. For Douglass, of course, this meant a cultivation of reading, writing, and speaking. These distinctively human activities elevated them above the brute creation, and therefore thereby set Douglass's course for liberation even before his escape from slavery. In his 1845 autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself, he famously recounted an incident when he decided to resist a flogging at the hands of an overseer named Edward Covey. And these are his words. Mr. Covey seemed now to think he had me, could do what he pleased. But at this moment, from whence the Spirit came, I don't know. I resolved to fight. Suiting my action to the resolution, I seized Covey hard by the throat, and as I did, I rose. Douglass called that episode the turning point of his career as a slave, when he resolved, quote, however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. I did not hesitate to let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me. In his 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, Douglass commented, I had reached the point at which I was not afraid to die. This spirit made me a free man in fact, while I remained a slave in form. In other words, he did not wait for unjust obstacles to be removed before he acted like the free man God created him to be. Douglass eventually escaped, fleeing to New Bedford, Massachusetts, and came under the tutelage of William Lloyd Garrison, editor of The Liberator, and in my opinion, the most famous abolitionist in America, if not the world. In 1845, just a few months after publishing his first autobiography, The Narrative, Douglass had to flee the United States because he explained in the book where he had lived as a slave and how he escapes, right? He gave details. Freedom of speech was not yet a freedom Douglass could exercise safely because the laws of Maryland and the federal government, under those laws, he was subject to capture as a fugitive slave. So for almost 2 years, Douglass spoke on the abolition circuit in England, Ireland, and Scotland, and he only returned to America after British friends purchased his legal manumission. He was no longer an outlaw on American soil, but a free man, and was now owed the protection of the laws. Although British friends implored him to stay, send for his family so that he could live out his days in freedom and ease in England, Douglass chose to return home for the sake of my brethren, as he put it, to lift up my voice in their behalf, to speak and write in their vindication, struggle in their ranks for that emancipation which shall yet be achieved by the power of truth and of principle for that oppressed people. As orator and writer, free speech would become Douglass's vocation. His words would help shape public opinion in America for the next 50 years. Upon his return to America in 1847, Douglass joined the ranks of abolition newspaper editors by founding with Martin Delany the North Star. He also made clear that returning to America as a free man was at best a mixed blessing. Douglass declared, "I have no love for America. I have no patriotism. I have no country." And then he asked, "What country have I? The institutions of this country do not know me, do not recognize me as a man." Those institutions were the major shapers of American culture and society: the church, the government, and the Constitution. Given that slavery could not exist without northern free states cooperating with southern slaveholding states, Douglass said of the federal government, "I desire to see its overthrow as speedily as possible." As for the Constitution, shivered into 1,000 fragments. By this point in his speaking career, he was used to being heckled with racial epithets, pelted with rotten eggs, navigating his way through anti-abolition mobs. And this was in New England. His condemnation of the American government and what he viewed at that time as a pro-slavery constitution made him few friends outside of abolition circles. They were considered a fringe, extremist element of society in the 1830s and 40s. In short, Frederick Douglass could not love a country that did not love him. To his credit, and I believe America's, he did not hold that position for long. By July of 1851, he was persuaded by political abolitionists like Lysander Spooner, William Goodell, Gerrit Smith, that a constitution that made no literal reference to slavery, the word doesn't appear in it, whose preamble spoke of justice and of liberty, that constitution should therefore be interpreted according to the plain reading of the text, without any resort to any sort of hidden or unwritten intentions of the framers. He also pointed out that the Constitution permitted Congress to ban the importation of slaves in 20 years, which Congress did as soon as possible, January 1, 1808. Douglass therefore concluded that the Constitution leans to freedom, not slavery, and it looked to the abolition of slavery rather than to its perpetuity. He now claimed America as his country, called the principles of the Declaration of Independence saving principles, and interpreted the Constitution as a glorious liberty document, if given a strict interpretation of the text. So Douglass departed from the mere moral suasion of abolitionists like his mentor, William Lloyd Garrison. Douglass now claimed that the Constitution was the abolitionist Constitution, and he sought a political solution to the problem of slavery. And not only in the federal territories, where the battle raged in that pivotal decade before the Civil War, but also where slavery already existed in the 15 states of the Union. Now, there were moments where Douglass preached, or at least commented, that the Union should be dissolved if free states continued to aid and abet slaveholding, in other words, by enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. But his primary message, his most consistent message during the 1850s, was that the best prospects for emancipation would occur within, not outside, the constitutional union. Dissolution, as Garrison preached, "Let our erring sisters go," might strike a blow for moral purity. "No union with slaveholders" was a slogan on the masthead of The Liberator, Garrison's newspaper. But allowing slaveholding states to secede would deprive the enslaved of any hope for liberation. It would not relieve citizens of the free states of their responsibility for undoing the harm they committed by extending slavery's lease on life through the compromises they made to maintain their union with the American slaveholding states. 1 month after Lincoln's 1860 election to the presidency, a meeting of Boston abolitionists was mobbed for daring to discuss how to abolish slavery. Douglass commented on the violence that disrupted that public assembly. To suppress free speech, he explained, is a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as those of the speaker. Douglass was all the more shocked that the mob preventing the right of the people to assemble and to express their opinion arose in Boston, the cradle of the American Revolution. Below the Mason-Dixon line, slave states employed despotic measures to silence opposition. Slavery cannot tolerate free speech, Douglass observed, and he described a free man as the dread of tyrants. And he concluded that the right of free speech is the right which they first of all strike down. Now, we're more accustomed to speaking of the right of free speech, free speaking. The right of the speaker, we're used to that. But Douglass insisted that the right to speak was meaningless without remembering, and therefore protecting the right to hear. By reminding us of the hearer, Douglass reminded us of the purpose of free speech, why we want to protect it, and why diversity of thought is so important. That's because the purpose of free speech is to persuade. It is an appeal to reason in pursuit of truth. So in highlighting the right of the hearer, Douglass teaches us that free speech seeks an audience. It's not an end in itself, but a means to an end. In a free society where the government is owned and operated by the people, it is a means of education, a form of civic education that a free people cannot do without. So freedom of speech required that citizens respect one another, even before we start talking. We owe that to each other simply because we are fellow citizens. We are members of something bigger than ourselves, the same political community. So this requires a kind of restraint or self-control when we speak to each other. To listen is to exercise restraint, simply by waiting one's turn to speak. Because in America, where the central idea is all men are created equal, we have to take turns. No one should have any more rights or privileges than anyone else. Now, each of us thinks we're right and we want to have our way be the way for everyone else. But in a system where you govern only by consent, you must persuade others to do things your way. So citizens should speak and listen in turn. Only tyrants insist on getting their way without hearing what others have to say. In the words of Douglass, there can be no right of free speech where any man is overawed by force and compelled to suppress his honest sentiments. The election of 1860 brought forth the honest sentiments of diverse Americans who had come to disagree profoundly about what they were owed under the Constitution. That election and the response to it by the various parties proved to be a constitutional stress test for the American people. That 1860 election, as in all elections in a republic, required two things: good winners and good losers. Southern Democrats announced before the election that they would not submit to a Republican administration. With Lincoln's election, they unfortunately made good on that promise and attempted to form an independent Southern nation. They did not trust Lincoln to be a good winner, so they decided to be sore losers. And the war came. When the Civil War broke out, Douglass argued that it should be an abolition war. When most loyal Americans, including President Lincoln, insisted that a war to preserve the Union was the only legitimate aim under the Constitution. But the friction of war eventually led the president to emancipate slaves in rebel states, portions of rebel states, as a means of preserving that constitutional union. A few weeks after Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, Douglass gave a lecture titled "Popular Error and Unpopular Truth." He said there was no such thing as new truth. Error might be old or new, but truth was as old as the universe. The truth that all human beings possess natural rights led Douglass to say of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, "A fatal blow had at last been struck at the root of that gigantic evil. The President's proclamation had given the slaves the legal right to liberty. Now they could obtain their personal freedom without trampling upon civil laws." So Douglass saw the proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, not as giving, but as restoring to the enslaved his or her natural rights, rights that human laws should have been protecting all along. This was an important observation, born of America's own origin as a nation founded upon timeless truths. The idea of universal, natural rights was what Douglass considered an unpopular truth. Unpopular because until 1776, no nation on earth believed what Americans held to be self-evidently true. Douglass noted that by emancipating slaves, quote, "Mr. Lincoln has dared to apply the old truth of human liberty to this time. He has dared to declare the truth of the Declaration of Independence." So with Lincoln and the American founding, Douglass believed human equality was one of those truths as old as the universe. And, as I said earlier, the friction of civil war, under that truth would begin to be secured to all Black Americans. But for Douglass, it was chiefly a contest of words rather than a battle of arms that produced emancipation. Though wrung out by the stern dictates of military necessity, he declared, it was in reality a moral necessity. Without what he called a principle in man which induces him to accept truth, Douglass held little hope for progress in human affairs. For him, speech, meaning an appeal to right and not might, held the key to the march of liberty in America. He pointed out that it was slavery that required violations of free speech for its protection. But he was confident, quote, that truth must triumph under a system of free discussion. And then he even quoted Thomas Jefferson to affirm that error might be left free so long as truth was free to combat it. And then he added, equally true is that error can never be safely tolerated when truth is not left free to combat it. In February, following the Emancipation Proclamation, Douglass gave a major speech at Cooper Institute in New York City. He titled it, "The Proclamation and a Negro Army." While he praised Lincoln's proclamation as the greatest event of our nation's history, Douglass spoke at length about the connection between freedom for the slave and freedom of speech. "Such is my confidence in the potency of truth," Douglass declared, "in the power of reason, that had the right of free discussion been preserved during the last 30 years, we should not now have slavery to breed rebellion, nor war to drench our land with blood." He insisted that slavery would have fallen, as it has fallen, when men can assail it with the weapons of reason and the facts of experience. And he went on to poke fun at slaveholders who claim that discussion convinced them that slavery is right. Douglass pointed out, discussion which only permits one side to be heard, compels the other side to remain silent, would be likely to produce just such a result. In other words, that's how you end up with slavery. In the South, one only hears from the slaveholder, but never the slave. It's no coincidence that on the side of the oppressor is power, while the slave is kept in weakness. The last thing slaveholders desired was a fair fight. For Douglas, this wasn't a matter of might, but which side could appeal to right. In December of '63, the end of that first year of Jubilee, with military emancipation by presidential decree in full swing, Douglas gave a speech titled, "Our Work is Not Done." Looking past the war's end and the abolition of slavery, Douglas predicted greater resistance to the elevation of the freedmen and freedwomen than to their emancipation. There was no question that they would need the protection of the federal government. But key to that protection was the right to vote. To those who argued that to grant the franchise to Black Americans was to bring brutality and ignorance into the ballot box, Douglas pointed out their hypocrisy. For they did not bar whites from voting who exhibited those very characteristics. In saying this, he replied, you lay down a rule for the black man that you apply to no other class of your citizens. And then he made it personal. Away with this talk of the want or lack of knowledge on the part of the Negro. I am about as big a Negro as you will find anywhere. And any man that does not believe I know enough to vote, let him try it. I think I can convince him that I do. He then proposed a test. Let him run for office in my district. Solicit my vote, and I will show him. By playfully shifting from the strength of his body to the power of his mind, Douglas invited any honest white man to treat him as an equal citizen of his community, and therefore worthy of an appeal to his mind in order to get elected. What was this but an exercise of free speech that appealed to free speech? A reminder that government by consent is a two-way street, involving the freedom to think, to argue, on the part of both the rulers and the ruled. Freedom of speech in this context is nothing more than an appeal to the consent of the governed as the only legitimate basis for ruling a free people. To speak in the public square is to argue, is to make claims about justice, what government could rightly command citizens to do. It is an appeal to each other's reason in hopes that informed opinions, rather than inflamed passions or even righteous indignation, will direct public policy towards the common good. This requires a public space that protects the expression of different opinions, which means some of them, yes, are going to be wrong. But only through a free and robust exchange of views can the public be equipped to tell the difference and choose wisely. It was that free exchange of views, in fact, what some would call intellectual diversity, that led Douglas to rethink his connection to America, its founding ideals, and its Constitution. With this conviction, Douglas devoted himself to getting white Americans to trust the operation of their own principles. In this, he foreshadowed Justice John Marshall Harlan's famous lone dissent in the infamous 1896 Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson, the one that produced the insidious doctrine of separate but equal. Justice Harlan wrote in that case, "Our Constitution is colorblind, neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law." 30 years earlier, Douglas observed simply that the Constitution, quote, knows no distinction between citizens on account of color, end quote. After the Civil War, Douglas stated that his goal was to make our government entirely consistent with itself. So he concluded that the burden of our demand upon the American people shall simply be justice and fair play. We utterly repudiate all invidious distinctions, whether in our favor or against us, and only ask for a fair field and no favor. Douglass found those principles inherent in the principles of the American founding. As President Bill Clinton said in his first inaugural address, our democracy must not be only the envy of the world, but the engine of our own renewal. There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America. What Douglass learned, even from slaveholders like Jefferson and Madison, was that the only relevant minority in this country was the minority of one, the individual. An apt pupil, Douglass concluded, color should not be a criterion of rights. He saw what no one could miss in the slaveholding republic. History had shown, of course, that the protection of the rights of one group, whites, came at the expense of another group, blacks. And so Douglass concluded, I know of no rights of race superior to the rights of humanity. He was a steadfast believer in equality under the law, and so he did not believe that race should be the measure of anyone's constitutional rights. He believed to focus on race was actually a losing proposition for black people. Instead of equal protection of the laws, Douglass declared, you lay down a rule for the black man that you apply to no other class of your citizens. And when he was asked the misbegotten, stupid question, what shall be done with the Negro when freed? He answered, let us alone. Do nothing with us, for us, or by us as a particular class. I affirm that the broadest and bitterest of the black man's misfortunes is the fact that he is everywhere regarded and treated as an exception to the principles and maxims which apply to other men. Douglass argued that as long as blacks in America were seen and treated as exceptions, color prejudice would continue, and they would never be seen or treated as full members of the American community. That said, did Douglass really mean that black Americans should be let alone? Do nothing? He went on to explain. All I ask is, give him a chance to stand on his own legs. If you see him on his way to school, let him alone. Let him go. If you see him going to the ballot box, let him alone. Don't disturb him. If you see him going into a workshop, just let him alone. Your interference is doing him a positive injury. So, blacks pursuing an education, a meal, the vote, a job. Does the government owe a black person, any person, anything when it comes to those vital pursuits? It was 1865 when Douglass made those comments. His audience knew the context of his examples. Blacks, in fact, were not given a chance to stand on their own legs. They were harassed, persecuted, even killed in their attempts to learn, to eat in a public place, to vote, and to learn a trade. To be left alone, as Douglass insisted, did not mean to be left at the mercy of a racist mob. It meant to be protected by the government, no more and no less, like every other American citizen. This was true equality under law, which is why the vote was so important to Douglass. To be freed from an individual legal master, but not allowed to vote, was simply to become the slave of the community. Douglass concluded, where universal suffrage is the rule, where that is the fundamental idea of the government, to rule us out is to make us an exception, and it is therefore to brand us with the stigma of inferiority, to invite to our heads the missiles of those about us. He gave many reasons why blacks should have the right to vote. But this concern for public opinion, what a ban against black voting taught whites about the citizenship of blacks, and therefore what they were owed by the government, this was a long-standing priority of Douglass. As far as civil and political rights are concerned, he believed the government of all should be partial to none. Anything that made blacks a special case in the public eye would undermine their equality as American citizens and as human beings. This, in his mind, actually reinforced a white supremacist mindset. Douglass did not see how the myth of white supremacy could be dispelled if blacks were exempted from the rules that applied to everyone else. With color prejudice as the great enemy of black progress in the United States, most of Douglass's efforts on behalf of civil and political rights were directed towards promoting policies that eliminated government distinctions based on race. Instead of living as an exception to the rules that applied to others, he argued that blacks should integrate with the majority white population as much as possible. They should endeavor, quote, to make themselves and be made and be made by others a part of the American people in every sense of the word. Whites needed to see that their destiny was tied up with the destiny of black people. And so Douglass encouraged blacks to avoid self-segregation. Quote, we should distribute ourselves among the people, build our houses, where if they take fire, other houses will be in danger. Common dangers will create common safeguards. It was the mark of their perception and fortitude that Africans on American soil and their descendants, in the face of pervasive racial bigotry, nevertheless became Americans. Denied the vote most of the time in most of the American colonies and then states, blacks stuck to the idea of government by consent of the governed. Denied membership in most American churches most of the time. Blacks still converted to the Christian faith. As Douglass put it, our hearts believed while they ached and bled. Blacks had taken America at her word. All men are created equal, and believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you shall be saved. And they determined to make a life and a future for themselves and their posterity in the United States, even in the face of color prejudice. His ancestors for 270 years, Douglass declared, have lived and labored and died on American soil. After many a thousand gone, if America was not the land of these many black generations, what land could be? Douglass was unwilling to let that black contribution to American progress go unappreciated and unrewarded. In becoming an American and then speaking and writing for half a century on behalf of the equal rights of humanity and citizenship of black Americans, Douglass helped America become a better version of itself. He motivated black Americans to strive to improve themselves and improve America even before unjust barriers to their freedom were removed. And he challenged white America to conquer its prejudices and to rise to the dignity of its professions. To do so, Douglass called the nation back to its founding, the Declaration's principles, and the Constitution's mechanisms of self-government as the surest guide for the equal protection of every American's civil and political rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Morel, for your talk. We have some time now for question and answer from the audience. If anybody has a question, you can raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over to you. Maybe to get the conversation started. I wanted to ask you, so it sounded like there's a civic education that might be necessary to prepare people to use free speech in the way that Douglass had in mind. Mm-hmm. He seemed to have in mind, as you put it, that free speech has a purpose. Could you say a little bit more about what the content of that education might look like for Douglass? He talks a lot about his own education and the narrative of his first biography. But what might it look like for Douglass on a broader scale?
Yeah, that's a good question. Those of you who are familiar with the great biography by David Blight, Prophet of Freedom, which came out, good grief, it's probably been out for a decade now. As I've been mentioning to people, it's the only biography we will need of Douglass in our lifetime. It is just that good. In that, Blight, and among others, have pointed out that Douglass's own self-education was this book called The Columbian Orator, that somehow that copy landed in his lap. And that was a collection of excerpts from famous speeches and plays and writings. And so his own education, self-education, like Lincoln, basically self-taught. His own education was what we would call essentially the liberal arts, the arts of free men and women. In other words, the arts or techniques of living as a free human being. In other words, freedom is not simply a lack of restraint. It's not just freedom from, it's freedom for certain things. A soul that had its capacities cultivated and habituated for life as a free person. And of course, life as a free person isn't just a lack of restraints, it's imposing restraints on yourself, where freedom is best enjoyed. And so I think that the general answer would be the content of civic education is reading classic texts about freedom and about the right or virtuous use of freedom. I focused in my talk on a particular legal right, the right of free speech. And for Douglass, that meant the encouragement and protection of the expression of diverse points of view, diverse opinions. And so let me just give an example. I've been teaching and speaking about Douglass for a few decades now, but Lincoln is really my specialty. And I teach a class called Lincoln Statesmanship. I'm teaching it right now. I told my students, just from the title of that course, it's clear what my opinion of Lincoln is. It's not called Lincoln, great politician, ? I'm not going to pretend I haven't come to a conclusion about Abraham Lincoln. I think he was the best politician this country has ever produced. Okay. However, I told my students, look, if all you read in this course were writings by Lincoln, I think that would be a good education, but it wouldn't be a great one. And why wouldn't it be a great one? And I'm going to answer as if Frederick Douglass was answering. It wouldn't be a great one because we wouldn't have seen the alternatives. In other words, we wouldn't have read and tried to examine and understand Lincoln in response to other opinions that were being stated at the time. And so in my class, as I attempt to make it a great class and not just a good one, to learn about Lincoln, guess what we read? Speeches by John C. Calhoun, right? The articulator of the positive good thesis regarding American slavery. In other words, it's not a necessary evil, it's actually a positive good, and he meant it not just for the master. He argued that it was good for the enslaved. I force my students to read that. Why? Because he was one of the great triumvirate, right? One of the three great senators of the antebellum period. This is the godfather of secession. This is the godfather of the Confederate States of America. In other words, he's important because he persuaded a whole lot of people to shoot in defense of this idea that slavery could be a positive good, not just for the enslaver, but the enslaved. So we read John C. Calhoun. We read Frederick Douglass. We read William Lloyd Garrison. In other words, we read people who Lincoln agrees with to some extent and disagrees markedly, on the other hand. We read his nemesis. Throughout the 1850s, the most important politician in the United States is a guy named Stephen Arnold Douglas, a senator from Lincoln's state of Illinois, a free state, but a senator who argues for this idea of local popular sovereignty. In other words, don't have Congress decide whether federal territory should have slavery or not. Let the locals decide. And Lincoln said, if you do that, what's actually going to happen is that's going to plant slavery out in those territories. And we know that once slavery is planted, it's never uprooted. those slave territories are going to become slave states. And in fact, with the Dred Scott opinion of 1857, what do you have? But a 7-2 decision where the Chief Justice argues that there's actually a federal protection of the right to own slaves in the Fifth Amendment. Once that's firmly ensconced in the territories, Lincoln says nothing is going to prevent slavery from being planted in the slave states because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And so I have my students read a lot of Stephen Douglas, the most important politician of the 1850s, because Lincoln says what's worse than Jefferson Davis arguing for slavery is a guy like Stephen Douglas who doesn't have to argue for slavery in order to produce the nationalization of slavery. So Lincoln called that invidious. And so what are the contents of civic education? I would say they would be a consideration of diverse expressions of what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a free society. And of course, what's that going to look like at the 4th grade level as opposed to, a junior in high school, as opposed to the kids I get right out of high school and then three years and on. I think more or less, at least the topics should be the same. Probably the readings will be adjusted in terms of how much you expose these kids to. But part of the thing is, I'll finish with this. Liberal education is not just a content thing; it's a manner thing. In other words, it's not just teaching kids what to think about. It's teaching them the habits of reading closely, being patient with others as they express their opinion, patience with authors you can't stand, but are trying to make the argument as well as they make it before you knock it down. And so it's not just what is that free people should value, but how they get to that. What are the habits that we have to have as we speak with one another, especially as we engage with one another when we don't agree.
You might not like it, but anyway.
Apparently you didn't like it. I had to say, go for it.
Based on your knowledge of Frederick Douglass, you've studied him, you've studied people who oppose him. What do you think would be his reaction today in terms of what's happening right now in our country, in the federal government? What do you think he would say?
That's a pretty general question. Can you sharpen it a little bit, or you're going to leave it up to me to reframe your question?
Well, specifically about our current president and the people that he's placed in leadership in our government.
So
what do you think he would
cabinet
say? Yes.
posts,
Sure.
As far as I know, none of his appointees have been rejected by Congress to date. I think the first thing I would say is that Douglass was really confident in our Constitution. And so as much as the current president is acting as if he's the head of a company, command and control, as it were, Douglass, his message to the American people would be to take a look at their Constitution and to use that Constitution as a way to produce the common good. For those who did not vote for Trump, think about Lincoln. Lincoln was elected by a popular vote of less than 40%. He had a clear constitutional majority in the same way that Trump had a clear constitutional majority. So Douglass would want to, at first, encourage Americans to reacquaint themselves with their Constitution. In other words, let's continue to act as a constitutional people, because that's what we're trying to save. In other words, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with a particular policy of Donald Trump's. And we got to remember, with Trump, I mean, both the supporters and critics of Trump know the drawbacks of Trump. They're not unaware. And I believe that it's actually a mistake, especially by the mainstream media, to continue to harp on the things everybody already knows they don't like about Trump, and forget that he won an election. All the battleground states, he won. Almost every electoral slice of the bologna trended towards Trump this time, rather than towards the Democrats. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that there's a goodly portion, 49-ish% of the American people that said the problems that they believed the previous administration didn't address to their satisfaction, they will choose the blunt instrument that Donald Trump is to achieve those objectives. So what is it that those people are seeking from the new administration? A different approach to the federal bureaucracy, a different approach, good grief, to education, to stick the front burner one, okay? So to circle back to Frederick Douglass would say, we have to reinforce the habits of self-government, and that means we have to reinforce our living under a constitution. And the fundamental principle of that constitution, besides its dependence on the American people in terms of modes of appointment, how those people get there who are ruling, is the principle of separation of powers, okay? So that means we have to look to the courts, federal courts. We have to look to Congress as ways of ensuring that power remains shared, as it were, distributed at the federal level. Let me tell you, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands here, but those of you who think that things are really bad in the United States right now, okay, Douglass lived through worse. Remember, it was so bad Americans weren't shooting at an external foe. They were shooting at each other. So Douglass has seen worse than any of us have experienced. And he had just this unremitting confidence in this country because of the principles that at least Americans profess to believe, and institutions that he believed were sufficient to protect our freedom. Won't happen overnight, but we could trust those things. I mentioned the Dred Scott case, 1857 decision. I think the worst decision, I think most law professors would agree, in American, the history of American jurisprudence. Taney from Maryland says that in this country, blacks had no rights that the white man was bound to respect. Right? 7-2 decision, okay? What was Douglass's response? One of the great speeches, in my opinion, one of his top, I would say top 8 or 10 speeches is his response to the Dred Scott case. You would think 7-2, that's a pretty bad day for Frederick Douglass. That's a pretty bad day for any decent American. And Douglass was hopeful. How can you be hopeful for a near slam dunk decision like that, which is said, not that slaves couldn't be citizens in this country, black people didn't have rights that vested in them as citizens in this country. That's what that decision said. That's one of the holdings. Douglass says, here's the good news. Americans aren't standing for this. In other words, it was a decision that produced, even though it was 7-2, it was a decision that produced a public outcry. In other words, for him, in his opinion, you had an unhealthy court producing an unhealthy opinion that, for law, is valid because it is constitutional, right? But it is an opinion that a major political party at that time disagreed with. They didn't say we should disobey it, but we need to find constitutional ways of getting the court to change its mind. So for Douglass, he said, I'm not worried about the Constitution. Taney has the wrong interpretation of it, but look to the public. The public thinks Taney is wrong here. And that healthy reaction to a notorious Supreme Court decision, Douglass got hope from that. It would have been a different situation altogether had a 7-2 decision produced a well-nigh unanimous public response of, nothing to see here. What's new? Yeah, that's the Constitution as I understand it. That would have been tremendously dispiriting to Douglass. The fact that you had a sufficient portion of the northern population that said, what? I don't think so. That for Douglass gave him hope. And so it's not just about the Constitution. It's ultimately about the character of the American people.
Very much. We're right at time, but I did want to give
What?
Professor...
Somebody's talking too long.
I want to give Professor Nathan Getting from Adrian College a chance to pose a question.
Thank you for your talk. I really appreciated it. You described Frederick Douglass as a champion of free speech and intellectual diversity, And I'm wondering about the limits of his commitment to those concepts. In 1873, President Grant signed the Comstock Act, which created a massive censorship apparatus. Ira Craddock, the sex educator, was persecuted to suicide. The federal government went after D.M. Bennett for his writings on sex education and free thought. Did Frederick Douglass, who was in his heyday at the time, express any solidarity or commitment to the freedom of expression that was curtailed by the Grant administration, and in particular the Comstock Act of 1873?
Great, that's a great question, and I have a very short answer. I don't know. I'm not aware, and I don't like getting asked a question twice that I don't have an answer to, and so I've got a free afternoon. I'm going to see what Douglass said, if anything. You said 1873?
Well, the reason I asked was that this was in Frederick Douglass's heyday. It was probably, the reason I ask is this was in Frederick Douglass's heyday, and it was probably the most censorial statute passed by the federal government, and I'm curious as to his reaction to it.
Well, you got to remember, 73 is just 3 years shy of, do the math, 76. In other words, there's a greater front burner issue for Douglass in 1873. And that is the waning of Reconstruction in the southern states. The vast majority of Black Americans live among their oppressors, their former oppressors. They live below the Mason-Dixon line, and their rights are steadily being eroded in the late 1860s, early 1870s. The Grant administration, without the federal army under Grant as president, the rights of Black people would have evaporated. And so I would, in speculation, I'll have to go check, but in speculation, Douglass's front burner issue is not what the federal government is doing wrong, it's what the states are failing to do. And hate to say it, but Northern whites are running out of moral and financial energy to support Reconstruction efforts in the South where state governments aren't doing their job. That I think Douglass would have tread lightly in terms of the issues he decides to pontificate about. I'm curious now to see what he would have said, if anything, about that. But I do know what he was championing at that time. Right, in 1870, he was finally getting the 15th Amendment passed, at least for Black men. Right, the amendment's clear here that it's males. 14th Amendment joined with 15th Amendment. He got in trouble with Elizabeth Cady Stanton precisely because she didn't want to give it to Black men before intelligent white women had the right to vote. And she, let's just say, did not say polite things to Frederick Douglass about that. So short answer would be, well, my short answer was, I have no idea. The slightly longer answer is that probably wasn't a front burner issue for him. The front burner issue for him was 4 million, close to 4 million Black people in the South who are now almost entirely exposed to majority white governments or governments that are letting organizations like the Klan run roughshod over them. Blacks have to fear for their lives if they cast a vote. And then, of course, you've got a string of Supreme Court decisions that are chipping away at the rights of Black people as well. But thank you. I'm definitely gonna look that one up.
I want to please join me again in thanking Professor Morel. And thank you all for coming out today. We'll have another talk on March 11th, which will be in this room at the same time. Be given by Clark Judge, who was a speechwriter to President Reagan. And so he'll be telling kind of the inside story on Tear Down This Wall. So we hope to have you again, and thank you for coming out.